Okay, so John Wesley had a strong desire and heart for discipleship and multiplication.
Yes.
That's what we just talked about. Another thing that is extremely important, especially in our time and our culture right now, is racism, social justice, and as I have read and studied his life, that was something that was real important to him.
That's right.
So talk about his heart, and then we'll talk about some of the things that he focused on, because he made an emphasis with his ministry and his life to focus on not just racism but several other things too. So talk about his famous quote about social justice and what it meant to him a little bit.
Wesley gathered these people called Methodists, the people in the societies and the classes and the bands that we talked about earlier. Wesley saw them as an agent for change in the church, but also in society, to make a difference in the world around us as well. Now, at one point, in speaking to his followers, he said, "You have nothing to do but save souls. So spend and be spent in that work." That's a stirring challenge.
Yes.
That's a great call to arms. You have nothing to do but save souls. Focus on that. And then he went out and reformed his society. He went out and worked against slavery in England. He went out and worked for the betterment of the poor. In the England in Wesley's day was a handful of people who were super rich, and everybody else was super poor. There was no middle class in England in the day. Virtually everybody who wasn't in the nobility or the power structure of the land was living from hand to mouth all the time. And Wesley found ways to help the poor. Wesley worked for reform of things like the prison system, which sounds like the last thing in the world you would expect a minister to be doing. But Wesley said, no, this is a logical application of the gospel. When he was at Oxford at the Holy Club, when he and Charles Wesley were leading the Holy Club in those university days, one of the things they did every week was visit the local prison and share the gospel with people who were there. A lot of the people in the prison were just debtors. That's the reason they were in prison in the first place, not hardened criminals. Some were, but not all. And so he took the gospel to everybody in the prisons. And in his lifelong ministry, he worked for the deplorable prison conditions to be improved. And you might think somebody would pull him aside and say, wait a minute, Wesley, you said we have nothing to do but save souls. And now you're spending a lot of time, and you're spending a lot of money too. Wesley spent money because he made money off the sale of his books and things that he made available to the ordinary people of England they wouldn't have had otherwise about spiritual growth. He plowed all of that money back into ministry. He died without a handful of dollars in his pocket at the end of his life. But he was determined to make a difference in society as well. So we could say, what happened to your statement about nothing to do but save souls? And Wesley would respond, I'm sure, saving souls without care for their bodies, without care for the mistreatment that they suffer, or without care for their welfare, is only half the gospel. Look what Jesus did. When Jesus preached his first sermon, recorded in the Gospels in Luke chapter 4, he based it on a passage from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me. Now, the word anointed is the word for Messiah. So this had always been considered to be a text about the Messiah. When people heard that text read, they knew, here comes a sermon about the Messiah. And they were right. Jesus said, the Spirit has anointed me, but the rest of the text says to preach good news to the poor, to bring freedom to the captive, to be there for the brokenhearted. And it's a series of social justice issues that the Messiah was supposed to do. And then at the end of the sermon, Jesus said, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. That was the time he chose to announce that he was the Messiah.
Right.
And his first text, his first sermon as Messiah, was about social concerns. It was about people's welfare. Here's the logic behind that. Does God love us? The answer, of course, is yes. Everybody gets that question right. Well, he doesn't just love our souls. He loves us. And we are more than our souls. He created us to be soul and body. Mm-hmm. The body is important to him. He's going to resurrect the body at the end of time. The soul won't die. Soul lives forever. So what does God care about the body? Well, he cares enough to resurrect it, right, and rejoin it to the soul at the end of time. God cares about our everyday welfare too. Remember that that illustration that Jesus used about people who saw him when he was in prison and came to him, and people who fed him when he was hungry, and people who clothed him when he was naked. And then they say to him, Lord, we never saw you like that. And he said, if you saw anybody like that, you saw me. I'm in every one of those needy people, and I want you to meet those needs and to be the people who meet those needs. Flash forward into the history of Christianity. Christianity was at the forefront of starting hospitals. That wasn't a government practice. That was a Christian practice. Christianity was at the forefront of starting schools, colleges and universities, but also public schools. That didn't begin as a government function. That began as a Christian outreach. Wesley used to teach the poor kids in Oxford in those Holy Club days how to read and write. While he taught them how to read and write, he taught them about Jesus. So his ministry was a broad ministry. Students asked me one time, who would be John Wesley of our day? Who would be the John Wesley of our day? And I said, how many people can I name? He was so many different things. Yes. He was a revivalist, an evangelist. He was a reformer. He was an educator. He was a teacher. He was a writer. The combination of those things made him the difference maker that he was in the church. And social issues, he said, were just an extension of the practice of holiness. When Wesley was asked to define holiness, he said, it's easy. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. The great commandment, he said, is a holiness code. Because if we love God and if we love others, then we won't just worry about their souls, we'll worry about their bodies as well. And so, when he saw people in need, holiness said, do something about it. Right, yes. There's a verse in Romans that says, holiness works no harm to its neighbor. It's kind of a reverse way of saying holiness is there to help. Holiness is there to meet needs. And so applied holiness, caring about other people, loving other people, means not only you want them to come to the Lord, that's goal number one, of course, but you also want to make a difference in the quality of their lives. And Wesley was a key proponent of that application of the gospel to people's lives.
Yeah. And wasn't it true in his time too, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there was just extreme poverty.
Yes.
And there was extreme alcoholism.
Right.
So much so that they were selling kids to buy alcohol. It was just total depravity really going on at that time. Just there was so much poverty, so much poor, not only in our physical needs, but a lot of poor in spirit.
Yeah.
There. So he lived in this time where there was a lot of hunger. He lived in this time where there was a lot of depression and a lot of very ungodly things, a lot of alcoholism, drunkenness going on. Right. People just doing things that you would just not even believe just to get alcohol, just to get a hold of some alcohol. This is the time that this man was raised up and he lived in. And so he looked at his society as we can look at it ours now and saying, what are the needs? Mm-hmm. What are the needs? And he cared about the widow. He cared about the single mom. He cared about those that couldn't get an education. Right. And so just so many, it is unbelievable. This is one man we're talking about. So many social issues that he's like, we've got to make a difference. We've got to do something about it. And it goes all the way back to what we were talking in our first session, to those class systems, those small groups. Because he looked at those groups, he's like, don't just sit there in your holy huddle. Go make a difference.
Yes. Right.
Go make a difference.
Right.
And so there's these huge issues, and one of the big ones that even I think the Wesleyan Church was birthed was through racism, slavery, through slavery. So just touch on that slavery aspect a little bit, and how John Wesley stood up against that, and you can kind of bring it forward some from back then.
This is the point where the story of John Wesley begins to be the story of the Wesleyan Church itself. In the 1800s, slavery was the number one issue. Early 1800s, slavery was number one issue in America. People were talking about it everywhere, but in church. It was never mentioned in church. Churches didn't want to go near it. It's like the third rail. They were afraid to get on the subject of slavery. They were afraid they would lose members. The Methodist Church by that time was the largest denomination in America, thanks to Francis Asbury and other people that Wesley had sent over to America spreading the gospel. Methodism was the largest denomination. And they said, we're too large to rock the boat. Don't talk about slavery. We'll lose a segment of our population that doesn't agree. But those who were anxious to do something about slavery pointed out that Wesley himself had been one of the earliest voices against slavery in England. And so they said, we're just doing what Wesley did. Wesley helped to get slavery eradicated in England. We're trying to get it eradicated in America. Right. And the Methodist bishops clamped down on them. Methodist bishops tried to silence them. They put some on trial, church trials, not civil trials, and took their ordination credentials away from them. They sent others from large churches down to pastor small churches as punishment for speaking out against slavery, for rocking the boat, in other words. Orange Scott was one of those leaders. Orange Scott was a young man who everybody said was destined to be a bishop one day. Leadership qualities just were outstanding in this young man. And yet he had this passion that to be truly followers of the gospel as Wesley understood it, we need to be saying something about American slavery. Eventually, he and 4 others announced that they were sadly leaving the Methodist Church because the Methodist Church wouldn't give them even the opportunity to start a movement like that or to speak out against slavery. And so they withdrew. They started a new denomination that within 2 years was 20,000 strong. And it was based on abolition, meaning the abolishment of slavery. These men were called abolitionists. This was 1843. And the Wesleyan Church, back in those days, was called Wesleyan Methodist. They were saying this is the kind of Methodist Wesley would be if he were still around. The Wesleyan Methodist Church of the 1840s was the most consistent voice against slavery of any of the denominations. And it grew rapidly because people who were opposed to slavery left their denomination and joined in with the Wesleyans to do something about this issue. One thing they did about the issue was to send basically a missionary to the South. The Wesleyans got started in the North as an abolitionist movement, but within 4 years they had sent someone south of the Mason-Dixon line to preach against slavery. 1847, this is 14 years before the Civil War began, in hostile territory. Now, I'm a Southerner. Yes. I was born in North Carolina and raised in the South. But the South before the Civil War was strongly pro-slavery, as you know, and to have someone come and plant a church that was anti-slavery in the South was risky.
Yes.
So the Wesleyans said, we can't appoint that person, but we'll take a volunteer if there's one. And Adam Crooks volunteered. Adam Crooks was 23 years old. It's just a little older than our graduates here at the college, Southern Wesleyan. Adam Crooks came. This would be his first lead pastorate. First time he was the pastor in charge of a church. And it was an abolitionist church in the South in the days before the Civil War. He was poisoned and survived. An ambush was laid for him, but it failed. He was arrested and thrown into jail. The jailer said if when the jailer threw him into jail, Adam Crooks said to the jailer, "If Jesus were here, would you arrest him?" And the jailer said, "If he was an abolitionist, we probably would." It's an incredible statement to make. But the Wesleyans were willing to suffer that kind of persecution to stand up for what was right and to make a witness. One member of the church we're in now, Freedom's Hill, the first Wesleyan church built in the South, pastored by Adam Crooks, that young man. One of the lay members of the church was hanged for his faith. He was lynched. He's a white man. He was lynched for his anti-slavery views. They came back to cut him down because they said, "We need the rope to hang another Wesleyan with." What they didn't know was he was still alive, and his family nursed him back to health.
Wow.
But that's what the early congregation had to do. You'll get a look at this old church a little bit later, but there were bullet holes in the door of this church. As a warning to the congregation, we shot up your church when you weren't there. Next time we may do it when you're there. And they kept coming. They never stopped. This church never closed its doors, and it kept its witness alive all through those turbulent days when slavery was such an emotional issue, and when abolition was such a dangerous stance to take. That's who the Wesleyans were. They were active on the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad was the way to help escape slaves, make it to freedom. At Freedom's Hill, there was a hollow tree near the old church, and it was big enough for one person to be hid inside the hollow tree. They would hide a slave in there during the daylight hours and then help them at night to get 15 or 20 miles further north, closer to freedom, on their way to liberty. That was taking a great risk, but they were willing to do it. Wesleyan churches all over were active in the Underground Railroad. Wesleyan churches in Indiana and Ohio and New York were on the other end of the Underground Railroad, receiving those escaping slaves and helping them escape. I don't want to take too long, but Luther Lee was one of the founders of the Wesleyan Church, and he was a pastor in Syracuse, New York, so he's near Canada. He helped 300 slaves a year to freedom. He hid them in a secret tunnel that they had dug in the clay underneath the parsonage of the Wesleyan Church, and they would hide there during the day, and at night they would lead them out the other end of the tunnel. In the 1990s, that tunnel was hidden so well it wasn't discovered until the 1990s, 150 years later.
Wow.
And it's now they've carefully removed it and placed it in the Syracuse Museum, because the slaves would carve things in the walls during the day as they waited for nightfall. Those carvings are still there.
Wow.
This is a tangible expression of slavery, but it's a tangible expression of the risk that the Wesleyans took to make a difference on that issue. And so slavery was an organizing evil, an organizing principle to fight that evil was at the basis of who the Wesleyan Church was. But they didn't stop there. They went on to stand up for others who were second-class citizens in America. They stood up for women, for instance.
Yes.
The first women's rights convention in American history was held in a Wesleyan chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. It's in all the history books. It's now a National Historic Site. And this is not radical feminism. This is basic human rights for women. They couldn't vote. They couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't hold property in some states. It went to male heirs, even if the women were closer heirs to the one who had died. It would bypass them and go to the closest male heir.
Couldn't pastor either.
You couldn't pastor. Couldn't get an education
Yeah,
in those days
yeah.
if you were a woman, past basic elementary school. So the Wesleyans made a difference there too. They made a difference in every way, and they said this is not in substitution of preaching the gospel. We're preaching the gospel and working for the welfare of those who are being unfairly treated. And they took risks to do that. It's a challenge for us today. Our issues are well known to us. We know where the church needs to be making a difference in society. And if we live up to our heritage, our legacy as Wesleyans, we'll be doing that.
I think that's so key. First, this church was built in North Carolina, right?
Yeah, it was in a little town called Snow Camp, North Carolina. when after about 80 or 90 years, the congregation built a larger, more comfortable church. They didn't tear this one down. By the providence of God, they preserved it. And we moved it here to our campus 20 years ago, set it up on campus as a living museum
Yes.
for our students to hear
Oh,
that
yeah.
message. Our ministerial students are commissioned at the end of their studies, their senior year, by kneeling at the altar at this old church and having us pray over them and the ministries that they're beginning, that it would be as courageous and effective as a ministry that Freedom's Hill Church had in its day.
Yeah, so that church is right here in Central on the campus of Southern Wesleyan University. You can come out here, look at it. I'd encourage you to do it. But back to what you just said, though, I wasn't raised Wesleyan. I'm kind of a religious mutt. I'm not a denomination person either. But I can take a lot of pride in being associated with John Wesley. A lot of excitement, too, of getting to know this man, the history and the difference he made.
Right.
And I can take that into being a pastor of a Wesleyan church now. And those of you that attend our Wesleyan church, I think you could take a lot of excitement and a lot of pride too in being associated with that, because a lot of people don't know what we've talked about. That's why we're doing this, so you understand the history that we stood up against in the face of a lot of opposition against slavery, stood up for women. But going back to John Wesley himself, he just cared about people.
Right.
Because they were created in the image and likeness of God.
Yeah.
And he decided to make a difference. He had great wisdom to put this discipleship system together, and people still just talk about it now, just the wisdom that he had to do that. But he had just such a heart that was just so huge for humanity. And so as we get ready to close this out, and I had to think about this in my own class too, and I had to turn in papers, and one of the questions is what are the issues today that the Wesleyan Church needs to stand up and make a difference with? It's kind of sad, but we're still facing racism in a very, very strong way.
Right.
And it's come to light in the last few years. Many different things have been happening. But as we look at our churches and as you look at your own life, how does God want you to make a difference? It's so easy to sit in our places of comfort, to sit in our nice seats instead of these old wooden pews.
Yeah.
And to just be comfortable and come into that Sunday service, not even getting in a small group, but even more so in that. We've been talking about this a lot at our church, is how can we make a difference in our community?
Mm-hmm.
How do we need to get more out there? And so that's why there's no justice without social justice,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's no justice without social justice. And so there are issues that not only us as an individual church, but us as Wesleyans need to pray about, because the men that he's mentioned, that he's talked about, they had great courage. Most of them risked their life. They risked their health to stand up for the gospel and to stand up for the poor and for women and for slaves. I mean, and some of them did lose their life. And they faced a lot of adversity. And I think we're so comfortable today that if there's any opposition, well, we're just going to be quiet. But that's not who Jesus was. That's not who a Wesleyan was, and that's not who a Wesleyan is. And that's not what I think God's calling me to be, and I don't think that's what God has called you to be. Dr. Black, thank you so much. Any final words?
Maybe just one last remark. The term social justice has been hijacked by political groups sometimes who want to use it to define their own list of issues that aren't biblical issues.
Right.
But what we're talking about today is biblical justice. We're talking about principles that are in God's Word. If they're applied to society, they make a difference. And that's the kind of social justice John Wesley did. That's the kind of social justice that the Wesleyan Church was formed on. And that's the kind of social justice we need to be engaged in today.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for this time. Thank you for watching. My prayer is that this is a blessing to your life, but it's also a challenge to your life.